The cabin door sagged on its hinges, swollen by decades of damp wood and silence. When the county men finally forced it open, they expected squalor. They expected the ordinary miseries of Appalachian poverty: hunger, soot, the smell of unwashed cloth. What they did not expect were the eyes, children's eyes that did not blink in unison, pale irises set too far apart, pupils clouded like stagnant wells. Their gaze followed intruders not with curiosity, but with something older, something that seemed to reach back beyond language itself. The floor creaked beneath the boots of the health inspector, Robert Mills, as he stepped into the gloom. He later confessed in his report that the sound reminded him of bones breaking, though no bones were visible. Not at first. Only when his lantern light swung left did it reveal a small bundle near the hearth, wrapped in moth-eaten cloth, still as stone. He thought it was a doll until he saw the hand, a hand too small, with fingers fused together into a single pale fin. The room was heavy with the odor of sickness and lard smoke. In the corner, two women rocked in unison on a warped bench, their faces weathered yet eerily alike, like the same portrait painted twice with minor smudges. They did not look up when Mills entered. Instead, they continued humming a tune without words, a lullaby stretched thin by years of repetition, its rhythm older than the house itself. Mills described feeling as though he had stumbled into a ritual already in progress, not a ritual of faith, but of survival. Children crawled between the legs of the women, some too old to crawl, their limbs twisted in ways that made standing impossible. One boy, no more than 10, smiled at the inspector with teeth that had grown sideways, splitting his gums. He laughed at nothing, a high-pitched sound that echoed against the rafters like the bleating of a goat. In that first moment, before questions and reports, Mills said he understood something wordless. He was not entering a home. He was entering the graveyard of a bloodline. And yet, despite the horror before him, the women did not tremble, did not defend, did not explain. They only sang, the children only stared, the fire only hissed. And Mills, though he was trained in sanitation and law, felt something deeper than duty rise in his throat, the urge to flee, to leave the mountain to its secrets. But he stayed, and by staying, he uncovered a history that had festered in the dark for generations, hidden in a valley where maps ended and memory failed. The valley where the cabin stood was the kind of place cartographers left blank, a notch in the hills where the sun seemed to lose its grip before reaching the earth. Old maps of eastern Kentucky show only a shaded patch, unnamed and unclaimed, as though even the surveyors had chosen to pass by. The locals called it the Hollow, but only in whispers and only when pressed. Most pretended it did not exist. The Hollow had always drawn families who wished to be forgotten. After the mines closed in the 1910s, men without wages dragged their kin into the timbered slopes, building one-room shacks from rotted pine. Some of them starved, some wandered away, and some, like the Whitlock sisters, stayed. Their bloodline took root in soil where no roads reached and no church bell carried. The earliest courthouse record to name them dates back to 1923. A marriage license scribbled in uneven ink, binding Martha Whitlock, 19, to a man named Thomas Hadley. The paper is brittle now, kept in the county's basement archives, but the seal is still visible. What is missing, however, are the other whispers. The letters passed between neighbors, the rumors that Martha had not gone alone into her new life. She had carried her sister Sarah with her, just 17, silent, unsmiling, already tethered to the same man. By the late 1920s, the Hollow was no longer spoken of in town. Visitors reported strange cries at dusk, not the cries of infants, but voices older, animal-like, reverberating through the timber. Hunters claimed to find crude charms nailed to trees, hair braided with twine, bones painted with ash. Those who wandered too far up the ridge came back different, refusing to speak of what they had seen, refusing even to point out the path again. The 1930 census lists the Hadley household as 8 souls in one dwelling, but those numbers never told the truth. The census man noted that the children answered questions in unison, as if rehearsed, their faces pressed against the window glass. He never entered the cabin. He wrote only, "Family appears reluctant. Recommend no return." That was the last time the federal government counted them. Decades later, researchers would comb through burial records and find gaps, infants buried without markers, deaths unregistered, names erased. But the land remembered. Old stones covered in moss bore initials carved by unsteady hands, rusted tin cans filled with bird bones lay scattered behind the house. Every detail whispered of a family that had folded inward, generation after generation, until the line could no longer hold its own weight. It was here, in this forgotten pocket of Kentucky, that the children Mills would one day see were born. Their cries went unheard by outsiders. Their names never entered the church rolls. Their blood mingled in a circle too tight to escape. And among those children, one stood out from the beginning, a boy whose body bore the mark of every mistake before him, yet whose presence would haunt the hollow more than any scream in the night. He came into the world one winter evening when the wind howled so fiercely through the chinks of the cabin wall that the women swore spirits were pressing against the house. His cry was weak at first, more a gasp than a wail, and for a moment they thought he would not live. But the child clung to breathe, his skin blue and waxen, his chest heaving in shallow pulls. They named him James, though the name mattered little in a household where children were seldom called by what was written. From the beginning, James moved differently. His limbs trembled, his head lagged heavy on his shoulders, and his eyes seemed unable to focus on the faces that hovered above him. Yet when the fire crackled, he would fix his gaze upon it, as though the flames alone spoke a language he could understand. By the time he was 3, he had learned no words, but he hummed low melodies that echoed the same tune Martha and Sarah had rocked to for decades. The other children joined him, humming in unison, a sound that unsettled any stranger who might stumble near enough to hear. The family kept James close. They watched him with a reverence that bordered on fear. His seizures began before he was 5, sudden, violent storms that left his small frame rigid on the floor. In those moments, his siblings would gather in a circle, not to comfort him, but to mimic his spasms, twisting their bodies into crooked shapes as if his suffering were a game or a lesson. When he woke, they looked to him with awe, as though he had crossed a threshold they could not follow. In the town below, word spread in fragments. A hunter spoke of seeing a child in the woods with eyes that rolled white, trailing after a sister who guided him by the hand. A store clerk whispered that Sarah came down once a season, her face gaunt, carrying lists scrawled in handwriting that didn't look like her own. The lists asked for flour, kerosene, lye soap, but always ended with something odd: chalk, twine, or jars of vinegar. Items not for cooking, but for preservation, for rituals of keeping what should not be kept. By age 10, James could barely walk upright. His spine curved sharply, his knees bent inward, yet he moved with a strange persistence, dragging himself through the cabin as if pulled by invisible strings. He took to drawing in soot on the walls, circles within circles, crude shapes of animals with split mouths, figures that resembled people, but with too many arms. None of the adults stopped him. The marks spread until the walls were blackened with symbols no outsider could read, and in the nights when storms pressed against the hollow, neighbors down the ridge swore they heard the children chanting. Not words, but syllables rising and falling, their rhythm in perfect time with the thunder. And always it was James who began the sound. The hollow did not sleep. On nights when the mist rolled down from the ridge and blanketed the valley floor, the cabin glowed faintly from within, its firelight pulsing like a heartbeat through the cracks. Travelers who lost their way told of strange echoes drifting through the trees, not songs, not prayers, but a broken rhythm of voices that rose and fell together, weaving syllables that did not belong to English or to any tongue they knew. James grew louder with age. His seizures became performances, his twisted body jerking against the dirt floor until blood streaked his lips. And when the fit subsided, he would speak for the first and only time, not in sentences, but in fragments. A name no one recognized, a warning that made no sense, a sound that resembled laughter, though it carried no joy. His siblings gathered around him after each episode, touching his hands, his face, as if drawing something holy from his broken form. Animals began to vanish, first chickens from their own yard, later strays that wandered too close. Their remains were found days later, feathers knotted into cords, bones arranged in spirals outside the cabin door. Sarah insisted it was foxes. Martha swore it was punishment for sins unspoken, but the younger children looked only to James, waiting for his next fit to tell them why. By 13, he no longer played among them. He sat in the corner near the hearth, his spine bent into an S, his eyes pale and unfocused, scratching figures into wood with a rusted nail. The drawings grew darker, men with faces erased, children with hollow chests, a house buried beneath black roots. His siblings copied the shapes in secret, etching them into the trees around the property until the entire ridge seemed infected with his visions. Neighbors began to avoid the old trail altogether. One farmer swore he found a goat carcass nailed upright to a tree, its mouth split open with twine. Another claimed he saw children crouched at the creek at dawn, their hands red, their clothes dripping, though no deer or fish had been taken. When he returned with others, the creek was empty, save for faint muddy prints that led back to the hollow. Whispers spread in town of witchcraft, though no one dared to speak the word too loudly. The church elders discouraged questions, urging silence. But silence cannot erase a stench that rides the wind. Even in the farthest pews, during the quietest prayers, some swore they could still hear the faint hum of children's voices carrying down from the ridge, led always by the broken rhythm of one boy, whose body should have failed him years before. And in that silence, the truth festered. The children were not born of strangers, not even of distant kin. Their bloodline had coiled back upon itself until the branches of their family tree had become a noose. The truth was written not in rumor, but in the brittle papers buried in courthouse drawers, marriage ledgers, birth certificates, death notices. When pieced together, the pattern emerged like rot beneath floorboards. Martha and Sarah were not merely sisters bound by grief after their parents' deaths. They had bound themselves to the same man, Thomas Hadley, a cousin by blood, a husband by law, a patriarch by necessity. And from that tangle had sprung children who were not simply siblings, but double-blooded, their veins carrying the echo of every mistake before them. The records told what the townsfolk would not. 2 women, both bearing children in the same year, both listing Thomas as father, yet cloaking it in silence by naming one another as guardians. The papers blurred the lines, but the bodies of the children told the rest. Curved spines, clouded eyes, tongues too large for their mouths, hearts that stopped before they learned to walk. Each grave in the unmarked patch of earth behind the cabin was another failed attempt to hold together a bloodline too fragile to endure. James himself was proof. His seizures, his twisted form, his drawings, all signs of a lineage collapsing inward. Yet within the family, his suffering was not seen as curse but as sign. Martha, the elder sister, believed his fits were revelations, fragments of prophecy sent through a body too weak to contain them. Sarah whispered that he was chosen, a vessel to bear their line into purity. They never admitted what the records proved, that purity was an illusion, and what they called chosen was only the toll of inbreeding grinding down their children, one bone at a time. By the 1930s, the cycle had already turned inward again. The eldest children, barely into adolescence, were pressed into roles of parenthood. Cousin to cousin, half, sibling to half, sibling, unions were arranged not by love, but by the cold hand of tradition the sisters had invented for themselves. In their minds, the outside world was corrupt, diseased with strangers' blood. To them, only within could salvation be found. It was then that the walls of the hollow grew higher than any ridge could measure. The family became both captors and captives of their own lineage. Children born to silence, raised in isolation, taught that their deformities were proof of divine favor, not of nature's decay. And when the town below caught whispers that a boy had fathered a child with his own sister, that infants were born without faces, without lungs, without hope, they did not send help. They sent fire. It began with smoke, drifting up the ridge one night in the spring of 1937. The townsfolk did not announce themselves. They came with kerosene, with hymnals clenched between their teeth, with the conviction that silence could no longer contain what grew in the hollow. The first to fall were the outbuildings, the chicken coops, the sheds stacked with jars of preserved roots and strange charms sealed in vinegar. Flames licked through dry wood, carrying sparks into the sky like fireflies fleeing judgment. The children screamed, but few dared to step outside. They pressed against the windows, their faces lit orange by firelight, their twisted hands pounding glass that would not break. The neighbors would later say they felt no triumph, only dread, as if they were not destroying evil, but releasing something far worse. One man swore he saw James standing in the doorway, his crooked silhouette writhing in seizure, yet his voice carried steady above the chaos. He was chanting, words none recognized, sounds that rode the crackle of burning wood, and seemed older than any tongue still spoken. The sisters fought back with desperation. Martha brandished a shotgun, firing into the dark, her voice shrill, calling the intruders thieves of God's chosen. Sarah clutched children by their hair, dragging them from the flames as if sheer force could hold back the tide. But the townsfolk would not relent. They killed the animals first, striking down goats, pigs, even dogs, ensuring no life remained to carry the taint outward. They shattered jars, burned records, ripped pages from Bibles, warped with soot and sweat. Every trace of the family was meant to be erased. Yet in their fury, they did not touch the cabin itself. Perhaps fear stopped them, perhaps superstition, perhaps the sight of James, his pale eyes rolling back as his body convulsed in the threshold, held them at bay. Whatever the reason, the house remained standing, blackened with soot but unbroken, and when dawn came, the villagers scattered, leaving only ash, carcasses, and silence. In the weeks that followed, no one spoke openly of what had been done. The church issued no statement. The sheriff filed no report. Mothers hushed children who asked why the ridge glowed red that night. Fathers warned their sons never to wander near the hollow again. And so the family endured, stripped of animals, stripped of neighbors, yet more bound to one another than ever before. But the fire had not purified them, it had scarred them, and in the charred soil of their isolation, the bloodline twisted further, turning inward with a fervor that would mark the next generation with horrors the townsfolk could never have imagined. The fire was supposed to end them, yet in truth it only sealed them in. The hollow grew quieter, yes, but not empty. Those who dared to hunt near the ridge said they still saw movement among the blackened trees. Small, crooked figures darting back into the shadows at the crack of a rifle. At night, smoke still bled from the chimney, though no one claimed to have delivered wood. James had survived. That much the whispers agreed upon. He was no longer a boy, but something else, his body withered, twisted beyond repair, yet still clinging to life when most said he should have been buried years before. His seizures worsened after the fire, shaking the cabin until dishes fell from shelves. But the words he spoke in their aftermath grew clearer. Some swore, his siblings began writing them down, filling walls with scratched letters and crooked spirals, a scripture only they could read. The sisters hardened. Martha's hair turned white before 40, her face lined not from age, but from fury. She rarely left the hollow after that night, and when she did, it was only to barter with strangers from out of town who did not know her name. Sarah changed, too. Her voice softened into something almost sweet, but her eyes carried a weight that made children cry if she looked too long. Together, they wove a cage of silence around their kin, raising new children in the ashes of the old. But the new ones were not born whole. Some arrived without fingers, others with jaws too small to close, still others with eyes that never opened. Those who lived were raised as blessings, their deformities celebrated as marks of divine favor. Those who died were buried in shallow earth near the creek, stones stacked not as graves but as warnings to outsiders. By the 1940s, the family no longer ventured into town at all. They planted their own corn, trapped game in the woods, drank from the same stream that ran red every spring with clay. Their names disappeared from school registers, from church rolls, from the voting lists tacked to the courthouse door. To the town below, it was easier to pretend they had perished in the fire than to admit what still stirred in the hollow. But every so often, evidence surfaced, a hunter's hound returning with half its hide stripped away, a child's doll found dangling from a noose of woven hair, strange sigils carved into tree bark on the edge of the ridge. Each sign was quickly buried, erased by men who remembered the fire and vowed never to repeat it. Yet no erasure could undo the truth. The hollow had not been destroyed. It had been reborn. And at its center, James, the boy who should never have lived, endured, his twisted body aging slowly, unnaturally, as if time itself recoiled from his blood. By the 1950s, the hollow was more myth than memory. Children in town were warned never to climb the ridge, never to follow the creek that wound north into the trees, never to answer if they heard voices in the mist. Most obeyed, but a few brave or foolish souls went searching. Those who returned spoke of the cabin, still standing though decades had passed since the fire. Its boards sagged, its roof sagged low, yet smoke still curled from the chimney. They said the yard was littered with bones, not scattered, but arranged. Circles within circles, spirals that drew the eye toward the door. And inside, they swore they saw him. James, no longer a boy, yet not a man, his body shrunken and crooked, his skin thin as parchment, his eyes pale as milk. But he lived. Decades past the years nature should have claimed him. He sat in his corner by the hearth, scratching symbols into the wood, as he had always done. His siblings, his children, his grandchildren all bent around him like worshippers, listening when his body seized, waiting for his broken tongue to spill its fragments of prophecy. To them, he was not crippled, not cursed. He was the root from which they all had grown, their holy figure, their proof that their bloodline was chosen. The town did nothing. The old men remembered the fire and swore never to kindle another. The younger men laughed off the stories, until hunting dogs vanished or deer carcasses were found gutted but untouched. Mothers told their children the hollow was cursed, that to even speak its name was to invite sickness. So the ridge stood, silent, avoided, left to rot, but the family endured. They bred within themselves, generation after generation, the deformities compounding until their shapes no longer resembled the town below. Shadows with two long arms, faces without symmetry, voices that hummed in unison, even in sleep. And at the center of it all, James, older than anyone could explain, his body barely clinging to life, yet his presence unbroken, a ghost that refused to die in flesh. By the 1960s, sightings grew rare. Some said the family had finally withered out, consumed by its own blood. Others swore they still heard chants drifting on the wind during harvest, a low murmur that rose and fell like the tide. A few hunters vanished outright, their names carved into plaques in town, but their bodies never found. And always the ridge loomed above them, a dark smear against the horizon, watching. The hollow was never cleansed. It was never buried. It was left festering, growing, waiting. And the family, bound in blood and silence, still kneels at the feet of James Hadley, the boy who married his own mother, the most inbred man America ever tried to forget. But the land remembers, the blood remembers. And if you stand too long at the edge of the ridge on a foggy night, you may hear it too, the chanting, the broken laughter, the sound of a family that should never have been, calling you home.